So, here's my first slide. I hate even using the word heritage because I think I used it because that was one of the big ideas from the STAR talks, but I think it's a very limiting way of doing things. You know, I've been very involved with BUILD and dealing with the new policies in the OPA and dealing with preservation services. I even hate that name, preservation services. What I'd like to do is look back at where we got to from today. I hesitate, this is sort of like the in memoriam section of the Oscars in terms of what has gone, and in fact the Toronto Star building fitting right at the top there, Globe and Mail building, the Temple building, and I think unless we really understand what happened to get us to this point, the Odeon Carleton Theatre lasted 25 years from 1948 to 73, the Shell building, the armories, these were all buildings that I think were demolished for a number of reasons, some of them for policy reasons, some for indifference, some because of people, the modern movement. These buildings, these shots are all from the 70s. It was like, the 70s were like an orgy of demolition. The Board of Trade building, King and Bathurst, Bloor and Young, the building at King and Church demolished just because the city didn't want to put in a new roof. This was all part of I think, a process. This is the St. Lawrence neighborhood in the 40s. It was our version of Old Montreal, or could have been. What ended up happening was, for various reasons, some political from the point of view of wanting parking for the financial district, some of it for other reasons, we ended up with this. And I remember working on Colborne Street for my first architecture job. That is what the city looked like in the 1970s. And I think that when we look at what the policies are today from the city, what they are is trying to deal with this. What I would like to do is look at it from a different point of view and see what really was lost. It's not just the big hits of the individual buildings. This is Front Street where Birksea Park is right now. We had entire neighborhoods that were basically obliterated, that it was almost like Berlin after the war. There was no, you know, to use Gertrude Stein, there was no there, except for isolated buildings. And what I would like to do, this is Front and Young, where you've got the Board of Trade building on the right, the Hockey Hall of Fame now in the middle, and the McMaster Warehouse. I think Tepperman was more well known in the 60s and the 70s, you know, than the mayor of Toronto. And I think what I'd like to do is take it out of the hands of just the typical planning policies and look at how do we remember streets like Toronto Street, which is known as the street that died, and there's the Toronto Star building again on King Street looking from York Street. I'd like to look at how do writers and poets and artists deal with it. And this was Chorley Park in Rosedale, a quote from Anne Michael's book, Fugitive Pieces. How could they have torn down Chorley Park, and how do you know you're in the right place? And he says, well, because we know we're in the right place because it's gone. And now it's just a park there, but that building was demolished for other political reasons. This block I want to focus on as a kind of test case. The block between Toronto and Church Street, King and Adelaide. You had in the 1820s the courthouse, the jail, St. James Cathedral to the right. Bottom picture shows John Howard had a plan, do a guild hall, join them all together, these isolated buildings. What ended up happening was typical Toronto style. It all got filled in with development but what was interesting is until the 1960s, those two old buildings were still in the middle of the block. It was like something out of Rome or Prague, where you demolish a building, you'd see the facade of the 1820s building right behind it. So of course, 1960s, what happens? Let's put in a two-story parking garage. That entire block gets obliterated. No mystery, no Prague, no Rome. We end up with a parking lot there and a rather banal office and condo project there today on King Street there. No memory of what happened. So what all that's left there right now in terms of the memory is a plaque that was put up independently, famous hanging that took place after the 1837 rebellion in front of the jail there. But the glimpses that you would have of the inside of the block that you had up until the 60s are all gone. So I'd like to look at the artists. In Berlin, in the 1990s, an artist named Shimon Atti, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, went back to the working class Jewish neighborhood and started projecting slides of what used to be there in those neighborhoods, that all memory had been obliterated. So you'd have the butcher shop, you'd have the school, you'd have the prayer hall. This was so controversial that he was getting beaten up all the time by neo-Nazis and people that really didn't want to remember what was there. And I think here we have a city of Toronto where half the people living in Toronto now weren't even born here. How do we tell the stories of what used to be there? There are sidewalks. Wellesley and Young, they actually put the 1858 cane map on the sidewalk, which I think is kind of cool. But then you've got Berlin on the top, little placards of Jews that were deported, the Rose Line in Paris, Freedom Trail in Boston. How do we work on ways, instead of just thinking of a city museum? Here was the Great Toronto Fire of 1904, which obliterated downtown. Who even knows about that today, and how do you convey that story? Imagine if that red line surrounding the area somehow had something in the pavement that could bring back, you walk across, you think, what is this? The other pet peeve of mine is lighting. This shows some of our Toronto buildings, experimental lighting projects a couple of years ago. For the most part, almost all our historic buildings are dark at night. You drive up University Avenue, York Street, Osgood Hall, everything is dark, the old City Hall. Nobody knows how to do it properly in Toronto. And I go back to Berlin. So imagine if instead of having Nuit Blanche once a year, we have actually Nuit Année, where Queen's Park actually is handed over to the artists. Osgood Hall, the old City Hall, something that raises awareness with it, which is one of the policies of the city, is to raise awareness of historic buildings and memory. We just don't do it.